This time, we'll look at what happens when engineers think outside the box in terms of their engine designs. Before we start, don't forget to like and subscribe for more content. Most of the engines that we take for granted today have been around for a very long time, whether it's two-stroke singles or four-stroke singles with side valves, overhead cam or conventional overhead valves, parallel twins with two-stroke or four-stroke units, V-twins in their various sizes and layouts, transverse triples, four-cylinder bikes, or even V4s. Most of the engines we know and love have been around for a long time. But for some engineers, following the herd is just not good enough. Because throughout history there have been engineers who have been determined to plough their own path, with varying rates of success, of course. The radial engine mounts its cylinders in a circle around the crankshaft. Obviously this makes for a compact engine, which is very cheap and lightweight, relatively speaking, for aircraft production. But it seems a strange choice for a motorcycle. Nevertheless, that hasn't stopped engineers trying. The Radial was a race bike with a radial mounted engine, and its mounting seems fairly logical in the case of this motorcycle. But there are other, slightly more interesting ways that the engine was mounted. The Red Rock Radial turned its engine through 90 degrees, and then used a vertical crankshaft, which was bevel geared onto a gearbox. This engine was only 250 cc's, so of course didn't generate a lot of power, and given its complexity, it seems unlikely it would ever have taken off as a production machine. As it was, only one motorcycle was ever built. But for me the craziest of the lot is the Magola. Built in 1921, it mounted a radial engine actually inside the hub of the front wheel. This meant there was no way of disengaging drive of that thing. It was a very strange design and must have been incredibly heavy steering. It seems like one of those motorcycles that somebody built just because they could, rather than it answered any real questions. In fact, it poses more questions than it answers as an engineering design. Now the sleeve valve, on first appearance, looks very much like a conventional side valve or maybe a two-stroke engine, but it's not. There are essentially two barrels, one sliding inside the other. Both have slots cut in them, and these are effectively transfer ports or inlet or exhaust ports, rather like you'd see on the two-stroke. The inner sleeve rises up and down with the crankshaft, and this opens and closes the valves, or ports I should say, and lets the gas in and out. The big advantage is the surface area for gaseous exchange is massive. On the downside, poppet valves do help to generate turbulence, which can help combustion. The big problem with the sleeve valve engine is as the sleeve rides up and down in the cylinder, it needs lubrication, and it's very difficult to oil, and it's also difficult to maintain a good seal. This means you tend to get a lot of oil being blown out through the exhaust. The other downside is that it's very difficult for the oil to get through into the cylinder, so the sleeve tends to get very hot and can often seize up. So engine failures are fairly common, particularly on highly tuned engines, as you would find in aviation. The engine is, however, very smooth and very quiet, so it was popular for a time in luxury cars like Daimler's, but its biggest success came in aviation. A number of successful aircraft would use sleeve engines in the late part of the war. These provided tremendous power and powered aircraft such as Hawker Fury, the Typhoon and the Tempest. In motorcycling, it was a British company, Bar and Stroud, who attempted to market the sleeve valve. They sold over-the-counter engines which were used by a number of manufacturers. The somewhat conservative approach that we often see in motorcycling did for the engines, because people would soon have an overhead valve or side valve engine because it has its proven reliability track record. The Rotary or Wankel engine has a rotor that rotates on an eccentric crankshaft. There's no pistons and no conrod, so in theory it should be a simple engine. In practice, however, much less so. Trying to seal the combustion chambers to prevent leaking is extremely difficult, and the other big issue is that these motors generate prodigious amounts of heat. Many early rotaries, like the Hercules 300cc engine you can see here, were air-cooled jobs. They were trying their best to keep the engine as simple as possible, but the big issues of cooling would dog the rotary throughout its use and cause tremendous problems for anybody trying to engineer one. The Suzuki RE5 represents the only real attempt by a major Japanese manufacturer to build a rotary engine motorcycle. The bike was produced for only 2 years, between 1974 and 1976. Suzuki's investment in the project was massive. They geared the factory up specifically for the machine, as they believed the Wankel would be the future. They took out patents on plating techniques to protect the combustion chambers. Suzuki was fairly unusual in that it was a single rotor, unlike the twin rotors used on the later Nortons. The bike has some really neat design touches. There was a cover which ran over the dials. When you turn the key to turn the ignition on, this sprang up and exposed the clocks right before your eyes. It looked really neat and was a very nice piece of design. Unfortunately, the bike reverted back to conventional clocks in the second year of production in an effort to cut costs, because unfortunately the bike was a sales disaster. It seemed that the punters just couldn't be persuaded to part with their hard-earned cash for a machine that was just too different. And there were other issues. Suzuki struggled to dissipate all the heat that the engines tended to generate. They had double-skinned exhausts with an intake at the front, and the engine had to be water-cooled, unlike some earlier rotors which were air-cooled. As a result, the machine was very heavy, around 570 pounds plus, with all fuel and oils in place. And what in concept should be a small compact engine turned out to be anything but. And then there was the huge radiator on the front to try and dissipate all that heat. Predictably, despite all Suzuki's work, excessive wear on the rotor tips and the end plates was still a problem. And then of course there was the fuel consumption. And this was particularly bad news in the mid-70s when the fuel crisis hit. Norton's rotaries would solve many of the problems which had so dogged the RE5. The Norton engine was much more compact and extremely powerful, and had an engine noise all of its own. However, fuel consumption was still terrible, and the emissions simply couldn't get past the regulations that were coming into place at the time. And the big issue really was that Norton simply didn't have the finances to make the bike economically viable. And so despite the efforts of more than 20 companies and many years of development, the promise of the rotary engine was never really borne out. And today, no major manufacturer is producing one. Well, if you absolutely definitely have to have the most power available for your buck, then look no further than the jet engine. Of course, very few companies have ever actually manufactured a jet-powered motorcycle. Other than the United States, MTT built the Y2K Superbike. This uses the engine from a helicopter to produce 320 shaft horsepower at an absolutely eye-watering 52,000 RPM. The machine has loads of unique touches, like it has a rear view camera rather than mirrors, presumably because they feared that any mirrors that might be fitted would just be blown off the thing when you hit full power. Now, the jet engine does not provide thrust as it does in an aircraft, but instead drives a shaft, just like in a helicopter, and this powers the rear wheels in a fairly conventional way. Well, sort of conventional way. The engine is designed to run on a variety of fuels, including biofuels, so if you want to save the planet, this is a pretty good choice. Well, sort of. Whilst the bike remains in production, you can't call into a dealer and just pick one up. This is a bespoke built bike, designed around each owner. and you can specify a range of different engines from 320 to around 420 shaft horsepower. Whichever one you go for, you can guarantee that the performance will be absolutely immense. Well, there are of course a few downsides to all this. 1. It's pretty bloody heavy. 2. The fuel consumption is god awful. And of course, most importantly, it's bloody expensive. This is a bespoke motorcycle that uses a jet engine. So it's going to cost you a little bit more than the standard Fireblade. Oh, and of course, you can forget about engine braking. When you shut the throttle on this thing, the thing won't slow down for miles, so you're going to need pretty damn good brakes. However, if you can learn to live with the bike's little foibles, and you have very deep pockets, well then the Y2K could be just the bike for you. Just don't be surprised if the neighbours complain about the noise. Well, I hope you enjoyed our collection of unusual motorcycle engines. If you did, don't forget to like and subscribe. And tell me, which do you think would be your favourite bike? Which one would you like to own? So the only thing left to say is stay safe, and of course, a big thank you for watching, and see you next time.